10. By action, girls, start moving around.
Welcome to the Penthouse Club, where tonight's matter of morals is discussing adultery.
Good evening. Welcome to some of the more pleasurable surroundings in which matter of morals finds itself. Tonight we're looking at, amongst other things, the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery.
That's a difficult commandment to keep under certain conditions.
Speak for yourself.
But under what circumstances can adultery be justified? Some people seem able to justify it.
King Solomon, for example, had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
And was faithful to them all.
He must have had a nightmare with the mother-in-laws. Well, nowadays, we can read about people like Marie, a modern-day aristocrat featured in Penthouse magazine.
She was married at 18 for wealth and position.
At 22 for love.
And at 27 for convenience.
An interesting piece of research there.
But an achievement, incidentally, which is nothing on Mr. Glyndamos Wolfe.
Who, in 1969, married for the 19th time.
A fact suitably noted in the Guinness Book of Records under the section on human endurance and endeavour. But in case you're thinking of beating that particular record, the actor Warren Beatty has some good advice.
I always get married in the morning.
So that if it doesn't work out...
At least it doesn't ruin the whole day.
Yes. Most of us believe that we have a right to love, and it may be necessary to search for it outside marriage. Adultery has variously been described as a search for love, a sin, a pleasure, a pastime, a necessity, or a tragedy.
At least one writer has asked,
how can we enjoy adultery without the least possible risk of tragedy?
Dr. Eugene Scheinman, writing for Forum magazine, advocates
cooperative adultery.
With respective husband or wife giving their full consent.
With this new approach to fidelity, he writes,
adultery involves no breach of trust,
no dishonesty,
no guilt,
and no need for divorce.
An alluring prospect.
Michael Sherwood, as Vicar of St. Matthew's in Fulham, you would, of course, declare unswerving support for this commandment. Isn't it a bit too restricting and too prudish?
It depends why you think the commandment is there. If you see it simply in order to say, don't do this, well, all right, I can see the point. But as I understand it, the whole Christian position is based on a positive understanding, which you get at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis. For example, the idea is that people should not be lonely, that a loyal relationship, a committed total relationship of two people to each other, including the sexual relationship, splendid. And for example, if I could just go on a little further, the Song of Solomon, and we talked about Solomon a minute or so ago, has a marvelously erotic view of sexual love, and that's a thoroughly Christian thing. But Solomon, of course, ended up with all his 1,000 wives and so on with a thoroughly unhappy home life.
But that was some time ago. I'm wondering whether today there are not simply too many voices ranged against your point of view on this commandment.
I'm not bothered in the slightest bit if I'm in a minority of one. Jesus was in a minority of one when they crucified him. What seems to me to be important is what it really is doing to people. And I can see that it could be very exciting at the time. It's the long-term results on society that I'm concerned about.
You talk about long-term effects on society, but can you, for a start, sort of without reservation, condemn adultery?
Yes, I think so. But if you're asking me in moral terms, yes. If you're asking me, are there ever circumstances in which sometimes it may conceivably have helped somebody's marriage, then without justifying it, I would say one can't deny there have been circumstances like this. But that's not to say that one thinks it is right, only that sometimes, in certain circumstances, I can think of cases where it's had a shock value on a marriage.
It is a very long-standing commandment. Why has it been so recklessly ignored?
Oh, because human beings being what they are, you know, a man finds a woman attractive. I mean, the fact that he's a Christian doesn't stop him finding a woman attractive. But I'm concerned with the thing primarily because, as I say, of what it does to people. Let me give you an instance of this. I mean, probably a lot of people here have seen the bouquet of barbed wire in the second series that's gone with it on television. Now, it looked marvellous at the beginning. Everybody was sleeping with everybody else. We've got now to, I don't know, you know, the end of the thing or something. Absolute shambles, misery. It's not the swinging image that everybody thinks.
But that's one picture of life which, as you say, is subscribed to by a lot of people. I'm wondering whether, in proclaiming absolute obedience to this commandment, you aren't really talking about an ideal, something very lofty, which is really not attainable at all.
Well, if you go back and look at the Roman Empire, sorry to go back in history, but it seemed to be a terrible, everyone was sort of having a right old time. Claudius on the other channel gave us some sort of picture of that not so long ago. Why did people become Christians in the ancient world? Everything was swinging. I think they became Christians because they got sick of disloyalty and distrust. And what Christianity brought to the ancient world, as I think it brings today to people, is not misery, not don't do this, but because there's something better, a great ideal, and some power towards achieving that ideal, then there is the corollary to it, which is that if you do this, you're going to create problems.
Would you be terribly disbelieving and disapproving if someone came to you, you are a counsellor I know in the church, if someone came to you and said that an adulterous relationship had in fact helped his marriage?
Well, I've met people who have said this sort of thing, and I think the difficulty about it is that very few of us have long enough to see it in the long run. See, I can imagine people having a gay old time, sorry you can't use that word now, but you know what I mean, having a gay old time about it in the short term. But I've had people who've come to me after 10 years, what started out looking marvellous, and the really terrible tragedies, both for them and the children and everybody involved. So I might be said to be a bit jaundiced about it, because I've had the experience of trying to pick up the bricks.
Michael Saywood, thank you.
Philip Hodson, you're editor of Forum, the sex education magazine. One of your articles recently was entitled, "Thou wouldst be a darn sight better off committing adultery." Why so?
Why so? Because Forum is a forum, and we do publish even unpopular points of view from our own point of view at times. I would not give, as Michael Saywood does on the other side, a blanket approval of those who always commit adultery under all circumstances. But I think that there are occasions when adultery is the right thing to do.
What kind of occasion do you have in mind?
Well, one example we spoke about the other day, which was if, as has been my experience, somebody comes along and their marriage is in distress, one partner has been crippled by an unfortunate accident, and that person is incapable of performing the sexual duties of the marriage. And that person has also said to me, look, I'm perfectly prepared for the other person to go ahead and have some kind of gratification or sexual satisfaction. In that circumstance, I think that the all clear is sounded.
Is that the only kind of circumstance?
That is not the only kind of circumstance. I think that today we live in a confusing and complex world, and there are times when we are not just using marriage in the old biblical sense. Today, marriage means many, many different things to people. It's a contract. You form that contract with one person. You don't necessarily have to go to somebody and say, tell me what marriage is. It's a relationship, a private relationship between you and one other. And if it includes infidelity, then as far as I'm concerned, those people have the right to make that decision.
Do you think that in some circumstances religious attitudes towards marriage can be harmful?
I think that I was thinking this particular point whilst Michael was making what I think is the best case on the other side, because he's still creating this feeling that sex is in some extreme sense sinful, and that when all the chips are down, you still mustn't do it because it's wrong, because it's bad, because it's evil, because it's harmful. I think that in that sense, religion has often given sex a bad name.
Do you regard yourself as a moral man?
Very. I think that the purpose of life, if you ask a serious question, is basically to have as much fun as you can in a responsible way. And if you're going to have a lot of fun, you've got to have some rules so that you don't overdo it.
Well, aren't the rules the very things we're talking about, like marriage?
You've got to have some rules, but I think we're also, in a democratic society, we're also responsible for making our own rules to a great degree in this private area of morality. And I think that you have to make that decision for yourself.
Well, it's clearly a subject we could go on talking about all night, but whatever the rights and wrongs of it, do you agree that your magazine to a certain extent encourages people towards adultery?
I think the magazine Forum encourages people to look at these questions honestly and openly. We, by and large, don't editorialise. We don't push a line. We just ask people to show what their experiences are, and other people can draw what conclusions they like from that.
Isn't it inevitably going to go that way, though?
Is what inevitably going to go
Your
that way?
magazine, isn't it inevitably going to tend towards adultery?
No, it's going to tend towards people making up their own minds about their own actions.
Philip Hodson, thank you very much.
When it comes to matters of sexual morals, we're prepared to listen more to our feelings rather than to those who tell us whether we're right or wrong. Lord Byron put it like this:
Pleasure is a sin.
But sometimes sin's a pleasure.
The second husband of Raquel Welch described his first meeting with her like this:
I can't say it was love at first sight.
But there was immediate chemistry between us.
I can identify with the feeling.
Aptly described by one writer
As lust at first sight.
According to one American researcher, men and women think about sex on average 8 times an hour. But is it possible, with these lovely pets around me at the moment, that my rate's going up?
Is it possible that sex is being used to play on human weakness? And is that right?
After all, as Oscar Wilde said,
I can resist anything except temptation.
can you resist temptation, Jane Hargrave? You're better known to many as the current Penthouse Pet of the Year. Where do you draw the line in your sexual relationships?
Well, I draw the line, I think, when... Well, let me put it this way. If you're prepared to put yourself into something as serious as getting married, you have to take into account all the things that go with it. And I know it's a very difficult thing to realize, and one can always make mistakes, but there is an alternative, and that is for many people these days, it's not absolutely necessary to get married.
You're not married yourself. No. Why didn't you get married?
Well, I suppose really it's my career that stops that. I mean, I'm not against marriage in any way. In fact, I would like to be married at some point in my life, but as my job entails traveling, and because I'm getting into acting and things like that, it's not fair to any person, any individual, to make them, I don't know, it's not a nice thing to expect from anyone. You can't expect fidelity if I'm away most of the time.
You seem to take it very seriously, this question. Do you think sex is always a serious matter?
Well, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think too much of a meal is made of it. I think with less discussion on the subject, it might not be such a problem.
Do you think other women would perhaps be better off to take your advice?
Advice on?
Or perhaps on not getting married?
Well, I wouldn't say that. It depends on your lifestyle.
Would you, if it came to it, would you sleep with a married man?
Well, it's difficult to say. I've never been in that situation, but I would personally try to avoid it because of the problems it might create. But if I fell in love with someone who was married and it was strong enough, then I'd be prepared to go through the problems that it might create.
Even though that, I suppose, might involve hurting somebody else?
It's just a matter of life, I suppose, isn't it?
Do you think of yourself as a moral person?
I think I do, yes, definitely.
How would you describe your moral attitude? What is it based on?
I think it's based on things I was taught when I was brought up. I went to a convent boarding school, Catholic, and all these things contribute to. I think I am a very moral person, yeah.
Would you say you followed the 10 Commandments?
Not altogether, no. I don't think anybody does, actually.
Jane Hargrave, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jenny Guinness, you were born in the United States and you had a very successful career as a model. Very well paid you were. Why did you give it up?
I gave it up, I think, thinking very much of what was said about Christians in the early world. I gave it up because, on one hand, I was in a very exciting situation. I loved New York, and I loved modeling, and I loved the people I was with on one level. But on another level, I saw so much distrust and unhappiness, and particularly in the area of relationships. I saw people hurt by two extremes of relationships. One sort, the very casual, egoistic, superficial sort, people just using each other. And on the other hand, very deep relationships. There was one relationship I remember, not extraordinary in any way, but it was very telling, and it really raised a lot of questions in my mind. It was a model and a director who fell in love with each other, and the director loved the model, but he also loved his wife, and he loved his children. And the dilemma was for him to choose. And seeing them in this dilemma, and seeing the agony that it created for them, and seeing on both ends the trouble that it would cause and the hurt it would cause, raised a lot of questions for me.
And apart from that practical experience, you also became a committed Christian, did you?
Yes, I did.
Did you find it impossible to reconcile the two states, Christianity and being a successful model?
I didn't, no. I quit modeling at that time, but not because I think modeling is in any way wrong or immoral.
Have the sexual values of people changed from the time when you were a model to what it is today, to what they are today?
I don't know, because I don't know what's going on today in the modeling world, for example.
But do you get the impression it's changed for the worse?
Well, I Don't think so. No, I don't think so. I grew up in an extremely liberated society in Southern California where most of my children's, my friends' parents were in their second or third marriages by the time we were in the second or third year of high school. And then I went on to New York where so-called free and swinging relationships were very common. So, no, so I don't think it's changed all that much.
You've had this very highly successful career, glamour and the feeling of heady success. Your life now must be, by comparison, rather dull and routine?
I don't think so. I think I have a very exciting life. I'm married to a writer, and we write together, enjoy that very much. We have what I regard as an extremely exciting relationship, and based very much on the commandment, you shall not commit adultery.
And what do you think yourself, particularly about adultery? Would you commit adultery?
No, I wouldn't. I think, what is adultery? Adultery is the breaking of trust. And I think trust is an extremely fragile thing. And I think the commandment respects our vulnerability. So I'm not saying I wouldn't break the commandment because I'm not vulnerable, but because I know that I am, and I think the commandment knows that we all are. And so I think the commandment is a very useful thing.
I won't expect her to listen to you, or maybe she might, but what advice would you give to Jane Hargreave, who is this year's Penthouse Pet of the Year? Could you say anything to her?
Oh dear. I think I'd say to her, Jane, live and experience the things that you think are right and see if they are right. And then at the end, if you feel they aren't, give Christianity a look.
Jenny Guinness, thank you very much.
You can't separate a discussion about adultery from discussion of sex, love, and marriage.
Marriage, according to some, is not so much a bed of roses
As a battlefield.
Or just plain boring.
In a survey of 10,000 readers of Woman's Own,
Half of the wives thought their sex life was below average.
97% thought that men benefited more from the joys of marriage.
And as a result of this, a quarter of the women
3 million if the sample is taken nationally.
said they had committed adultery.
And if you happen to be a married person and unsatisfied, a magazine in America called Select
Offers its services to couples engaged in wife-swapping.
A not altogether unknown practice in England, aptly expressed perhaps in a cartoon from Penthouse magazine.
Where's your husband?
It's all right, sweetheart, he's with your wife.
Reverend Jocelyn Gundry, as a parish priest, are you aware that this sort of thing goes on?
Well, if the papers are believed, it does go on.
And what form does it take? How is it organized?
Well, I haven't had personal experience, but I imagine that the couples are invited to a party, and there's a sort of tray put in the hall, I'm told, and they put their keys in, and the wife, the husband takes somebody else's key and goes off with the wife, who belongs to that dwelling house.
Knowing that this does go on, can you really condemn it without any reservation at all? Can you say that it's bad when, from what you say, it would seem that there is perhaps a certain inevitability about this sort of thing going on?
No, I don't think. I condemn it absolutely and completely. And I would say this, that if one is talking about adultery, I think one really has to look at the causes for adultery. And I think when somebody commits adultery, there are two basic reasons. First of all, it may be a cri de coeur, please notice me, please help me, or it may be that the marriage is completely on the rocks and they are therefore committing adultery. And I think this is very important to know.
I'm glad you mentioned the question about a marriage being on the rocks, you see, because some people would use that to say that an adulterous relationship might be able to fortify a marriage in some way.
Well, I couldn't agree at all with that. I think in the days in which we live, we know so much more about psychology and psychiatry and analysis, and I think that we can help people to find out what marriage is really all about. And 100 years or so ago, I think people would have said that marriage was primarily to have children. And I think today marriage, of course it's to have children, and this is a very important part of marriage, but an equally important part of marriage is to help the partners to grow together in love. The first thing is to come together as an act of faith, and then it's a growing partnership. And I think no longer can the husband think of the wife as the housekeeper and the bearer of his children. No longer can the wife think of the husband as the breadwinner of the family. They've both got to help each other to grow, to become creative, and to become the sort of people that God intended them to be.
And can you, on the other hand, point to the practical dangers about an adulterous relationship?
What do you mean exactly by that?
Well, what are the sort of practical pitfalls for an average family?
The practical pitfalls as a parish priest, every day and every week and every year, I'm coming into contact with people, terrible human tragedy as a result of adulterous relationships. In my own parish, I can cite any amount of cases. A boy whose father has gone off and who for 6 or 7 months has been sobbing himself to sleep night after night after night. A girl whose father has gone off and who is in a very disturbed condition at school, at home, and the father thinks that he's helping her by lavishing tremendous presents upon her, giving her expensive ponies and all the rest of it.
But it doesn't work.
But it doesn't work.
Reverend Justin Gandhi, thank you very much.
David Dewey, you're a sociology lecturer and you're at this moment writing a book called The Sociology of Sin. Why do you think that when the word sin comes up, the letters sex inevitably appear in some people's minds?
Well, it's certainly true that people, very often when they think of sin, think of sex. This may go back to the early Genesis story, whereby original sin is conceived in rather sexual terms, in that man was tempted by a woman, and the only thing she had to tempt him with, as they were naked at the time, was her sexuality. Now, whether the story is true or not, or whether what I've said is theologically valid or not, is beside the point. The fact is that the legacy of that has come down to us with all kinds of inhibition about sexuality.
Why do you think that we look at it so differently over the years? I mean, in Victorian times, it was rude to have a naked piano leg, virtually, and yet today you've got a certain newspaper with a certain pin-up on page 3, and nobody bats an eyelid at it.
Well, in Victorian times, it was sufficient to assert the commandment as binding upon all situations. There was no discussion about what kind of acts came under that commandment, and an authoritarian approach was sufficient for people to accept the injunction. Today, people are saying what's the basis of the injunction, and where they find it unsatisfactory are looking for alternative courses of action.
Is it not, then, in your view, a straight question of right and wrong?
Well, I think you can talk about right and wrong in terms of the principle. After one has the principle against adultery, one also has the question of particular acts which may or may not be in breach of that principle.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I think, if I may, I'd like to say what I understand the principle to be. Because thou shalt not commit adultery was written in a particular historical context. And the question then is, how do people see it as relevant now? And I would like to suggest that its relevance now is where people actually delight in adultery, where they willfully and for pleasure and persistently break trusting relationships. So that seems to me difficult to defend.
It's wrong if it's fun?
No. It's wrong if people deliberately break contracts they've entered into and delight in so doing. Now, it's quite another matter. It's a different sort of judgment, if you like, as to whether particular sexual encounters are in breach of the principle as I've stated it. And I think enough has been said by other people to indicate that that need not necessarily be true.
Are we right to be so serious about the whole thing, to be talking about sin and guilt?
Well, I think society has a great deal to answer for in making people feel guilty about their various sexual feelings. Of course, that runs very much wider than adultery.
Do you think, then, that somewhere like the Penthouse, for example, is actually perhaps encouraging people to commit adultery?
Well, I don't see how one could say that, really. It may be that people that come here do, and quite certainly others that do, don't. The point is, from a sociological angle, the issue isn't researchable. So I'm in no position to make a judgment. If I went out and asked people at the door if they were on their way to commit adultery, they may give me answers that I could codify statistically, but there's a thing that we call response error. One couldn't be sure whether people were telling the truth.
David Dewey, thank you very much indeed.
Despite any impressions, which I'm sure you haven't received, that this program's been about sex, it has in fact been about sex and marriage.
In Britain, there are still 12 million intact marriages.
Bernard Shaw said marriage is popular
Because it combines the maximum of temptation
with the maximum of opportunity.
A view of sex which few happily married people would wish to disagree with. But what about those unhappy, unsatisfactory marriages? As one slogan put it,
end human sacrifice.
Don't get married.
or as Hugh Hefner's girlfriend put it,
Hef's got a thing about marriage.
We think it might spoil our relationship.
well, what about those who are married and are unsatisfied?
Some sociologists would say that the problem with man
Is not that he ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil,
but that he didn't get enough of it.
Adultery might not be a forbidden fruit after all, but a necessary part of life. An apple a day keeps the doctor away.
As a young man, John Donne wrote that a variety of lovers
is the only guarantee of true pleasure.
but according to one ancient writer,
He who commits adultery
destroys himself.
And with that and various other embarrassing conflicts of opinion, we leave you. We say thank you to the Penthouse Club, to all our guests. Good night.